friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Television. I'm your host, Carter Seaton, and it's great to have you with us today. Today, our distinguished guest is distinguished author Mesha Maren. Mesha's novels have included Sugar Run and Perpetual West, but her short stories and essays can be read in various prestigious literary publications. She was the recipient of the 2015 Thomas Wolfe Fiction Prize, the 2014 Elizabeth George Foundation Grant, and other grants and fellowships. She was the 2018-19 Keenan Visiting Writer at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She is currently an assistant professor of the practice of English at Duke University and also serves as a National Endowment of the Arts Writing Fellow at the Federal Prison Camp in Alderson, West Virginia. Mesha, it's so good to have you with us.
Thank you, Carter. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm so grateful.
Good, thank you. Your book, Perpetual West, has been called stunning, a forceful addition to the literature of the U.S.-Mexico border and its ongoing history of tragedy and joy. That was the New York Times Book Review. It was called suspenseful, seductive, a thrill ride from cover to cover by Oprah Daily, and the most 50 anticipated books of 2022. And I have to agree with every single one of those. So many times when I was reading it, I found myself staying up too late to find out what was going to happen to Alex or Elena. It was a great read. Can you give us a short synopsis of Perpetual West?
Yes. So Perpetual West is a novel that follows three characters. It begins with two characters, Alex and Alana, who come from Appalachia. Alex grew up in West Virginia, and Alana grew up between Virginia and West Virginia. And they meet in a small college town in Virginia where Alana's father is teaching, and both Alana and Alex are students. When the book begins, the reader travels with them west towards Texas, which is actually Alex's birthplace. He was adopted by a couple in West Virginia, but he was born on the U.S.-Mexico border in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and he's never been there as an adult. So they're returning both for Alex to start a graduate program in sociology, but also so that Alex can learn more about the place that he came from. And then the third character comes in a bit later and is a young professional wrestler living just across the river in Ciudad Juarez.
I mean, you're from North Carolina, you're living in North Carolina, you have
Yes.
rural roots in West Virginia. What prompted you to set a book on that border between El Paso and Juarez?
So a big part of it came from my own life. When I was just past, I think a couple weeks past my 21st birthday, I took a Greyhound bus from Asheville, North Carolina to El Paso, Texas. And I lived out there for a period of about 9 months, I guess, and was really impacted by it in many ways. I assumed going there that it was going to be very, very different than anything that I'd ever known before, which was mostly, as you said, West Virginia, where I grew up, and then Western North Carolina, where I'd been living after high school. And of course, there were many, many differences. Landscape was very different, and much drier and flatter, although there are mountains out there too. But what I was actually taken in by the most was similarities, which I hadn't really expected. Both the edge of Texas there in northern Mexico has a lot in common with West Virginia in terms of it being a place of extraction. There are a lot of extractive industries along the border there, both in terms of earth extraction and elemental extraction, but also later in the 90s, there started to be a lot of factories, the maquiladoras, as they're often called, right there along the border. And so extraction of labor also. And the people that I met there loved the place they were from in a really deep way. Not even just despite, but I think sometimes because of what a difficult place it is. And that felt like West Virginia to me too. I really related to that. So I knew I wanted to write about that little corner of the world for a very long time. And I tried to write about it in a more kind of straightforward nonfiction kind of way, write about my experience there. And for whatever reason, lack of skill on my part, maybe, or just the way things were. It wasn't working out. And so then I decided to take it in a different direction and think about it as a novel, keeping some of the elements the same, but letting myself change things at will. And it worked, or at least I was able to build a book out of it in that way.
I'd say it did work, yes.
Thanks.
Are the characters Alana and Alex patterned in any fashion on people that you knew?
They are. What's funny is people ask me a lot, because my first book, Sugar Run, is set mostly in West Virginia, and there's and it takes place in what is kind of a fictionalized version of my hometown of Alderson. So people, I think, understandably thought that book might be my more autobiographical one, but in certain ways there's more of me and my family in Perpetual West, despite the fact that it takes place in Mexico, and my family is from West Virginia and North Carolina. But yes, so I think that there's parts of me in every one of my characters, but I think that Alana, her life circumstances are more similar to my own. She's about the age that I was when I went out to Texas, and she's really struggling with whether or not college is the right place for her, which I waited to go to college until I was 26, because I kind of knew even more strongly than Alana does that wasn't the right thing for me right out of high school. But Alana has a brother who's struggling with substance abuse issues, which was something that came from my own family experience. And the wrestler character, Mateo, is also in many ways modeled off of a friend that I made out there, a wrestler who was very generous with me when I was writing the book and allowing me to interview him and ask him all kinds of questions about professional wrestling in Mexico and the life of a professional wrestler. So there's a lot of ways that these characters bring to life elements of people that I know.
Well, that was going to be about the next question I was going to ask you, is how did you learn about the wrestling? Whether or not that took a lot of research, but if you met somebody there.
Yes. So it did take a lot of research, and I went about the research in a few different ways. I already knew that I was kind of interested in wrestling, and I guess that's why I brought it into the book, is because I had seen a little bit of wrestling, small time local wrestling in West Virginia when I was growing up, and I was interested in that. And when I was living on the border and spending some time in Ciudad Juarez, I went to a couple wrestling events that reminded me of the wrestling events I'd seen when I was a kid. Just small affairs, but really the audience was really excited and really kind of, it was like a hometown hero kind of feel to it. So I read a lot. I interviewed this wrestler who, as I said, was very generous with answering my questions. And then there got to be a certain point where I had done a lot of research, but I realized I didn't know what it actually felt like to stand in the ring. I didn't know what the ropes felt like. And so I started to go to a wrestling school in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this may come as no big surprise to anyone, but I am not very good at wrestling. I did not manage to make my way through this school very well, but the teacher, LeBron Cozone, there was amazing. He was really generous with understanding that I was approaching it from a research angle, and he treated me like any other student. But after a while, when I was throwing myself against the mat over and over again, he said, don't give yourself a concussion, then you're never going to be able to write the novel. And so I pivoted towards getting the physical experiences that I needed to know how to write that character, but also observing more and just spending time in the gym and kind of collecting those sensory experiences that allowed me to feel like I could write Mateo in an embodied way.
Right. Yeah. So that gives you a sense really of the culture by being almost a part of it. Yeah. Exactly.
And there are differences between, wrestling in the US and in Mexico, but there's, especially when it comes to small time, like not the big WWF, but the small time, there's more similarities, I think, than there are differences.
Right. Was there ever a hint in Mexico of the relationship between the wrestling and the cartels or the mobs?
There were hints of that, I think there were hints of that, and ways in which that was kind of woven into certain aspects of people's lives. I think that it was pretty dangerous to talk about it, so I didn't ask a whole lot of questions. But I think that sadly that the cartel is so insidious. It's woven into the inner workings of so many parts of life, especially there at the border region where drugs are being trafficked across the border. And so there's this sort of don't ask, don't tell, kind of like, don't, it's there, but we're not gonna,
Curious.
yeah. And so I think that it seemed to me that if I wrote a novel set there in the time period when I had it set, in the place where I had it set, and I didn't write at all about the sort of insidious impact of the cartel, that it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be right, that I wouldn't be depicting what life was like. And so I didn't want to glorify the cartel at all, but I also felt that it would be an error to completely leave it out.
Your description of the two cities took me back to a trip I took there in, I think, 93. My son and I were going to kind of a cross country thing, and we stopped in El Paso, and I was a runner back then, so I wanted to literally run into Mexico. So
Yeah.
we crossed the border right there at that passageway. It's
Yeah.
kind of a bridge sort of thing. But I was amazed at the contrast, complete contrast between the two cities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, El Paso is a fairly cosmopolitan, if you will, Texas city with skyscrapers and so forth. And Ciudad Juarez is absolutely not.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Is it because you think of the poverty in Mexico, or is it?
I think that it's a very constructed I think that the reality that you saw and I saw there too is very intentional, that it's been built that way. People in power in the US and in Mexico invest in El Paso. I mean, for a long period of time, the mayor of Ciudad Juarez lived in El Paso. US banks have no problem with members of the cartel in keeping their money in US banks. I don't think it's even really that hidden. Or spending money on constructing buildings in Texas. And so there's a lot of money that gets pumped into the El Paso side. And
which only exacerbates the poverty over there.
Exactly. Almost no money goes back into Juarez. And not only is money not really being spent in the communities there, but corporations, not just US corporations, but there are a lot of US corporations that have factories on the southern side of that border. And it benefits them, obviously, to keep the level, the poverty and the desperation benefit them, because then they can pay very, very low wages and people will still work at those wages because there is nothing else. So I think that that there's a way in which you can look at that particular border as being demonstrative of something larger that's happening, worldwide. But that's one little angle on it, and it is in no way an accident, right? It was constructed that way, not only by policies coming out of Mexico, but also by US policies. I mean, the other part of the equation is the number of guns that go into Mexico from the US. One of the most ironic things to think about when you think about the violence in Mexico is the fact that actually Mexico has very strict gun control laws, and there's actually only one single gun store that the public can purchase guns from, and they're very stringent about who can. So then you have to ask yourself, well, where do people get guns, right? And the answer is they almost all come from the US. If you follow the serial numbers and you track them back, they almost all come from the US. There was a period of time where the mayor of Ciudad Juarez had constructed a sign facing north, facing the US border, that was pleading with US officials to do something to stop what people call the river of steel coming south. And So yeah, it's not an accident what you see there, the discrepancies.
Mhm. The book also is about testing gender identity. Why was it important for you to make that a part of Alex's persona?
I always get a little tripped up on these kinds of questions, and I think that's more my fault than anything else. But I think it has to do with the fact of how my characters, how I feel like my characters kind of like come to me, which is that it's a funny description, but maybe the best way to describe when I'm working with characters is I feel like I'm approaching them the way that you would like a stray cat who you wanted to befriend. That the characters are kind of there, but they're easily scared away, and I have to carefully befriend them. And that's sort of my process of developing the characters. I spend time with them and try to get them to trust me. And in that process, they reveal things about themselves. And I know that this all sounds a little crazy because I'm creating the characters in my head, right? But
Yeah.
that's all to say, I don't feel as if I make choices, even though I know I do, but it doesn't feel like I choose to make Alex queer, or it feels like in the process, the same way that if you meet a new friend and you start to get to know them, after a while, if they trust you enough, certain things will come to the surface, and that's how it feels on my characters.
Mhm.
So then when something like that comes to the surface, then I sit with it and think, oh, okay, here's a new element of this character, which will now be a new element of this book.
The book, right?
Where does that sit with other things that are going on in the book? And I mean, obviously, because I'm creating the characters, even if I feel like I'm befriending them, I'm really creating them. Obviously, those are questions that are coming from deeply within my own mind. And I think that questions of identity having to do with place, and identity having to do with sexuality and gender are just questions that for a very, very long time I've always been fascinated by,
Mhm.
asking those questions of myself, but then naturally also asking them of my characters.
Um, so then when that happens, when this person tells you that they
Yeah.
are gender questioning, then that opens up something else in the book that you
Right.
have to go with.
Yes.
And I've been thinking recently about the intersection between the character and the plot. And
Yeah.
it seems to me that they really are inextricably linked, because if it's hard to separate. If you hadn't discovered that this character was gay in your
Right.
own mind, then the whole plot would have been completely different.
Yes. Yes. Well, I like hearing that. I'm very glad to hear you say that, because that speaks to that makes sense to me as far as the way my process goes, but it's also the way that I would like my books to feel, which is that the plot is a natural outgrowth of the characters, and not the other way around.
Right.
This is not, I don't think that this is any way necessarily a strength, but it's just a truth of my writing. I think I struggle the most with plot and structure. It's always what I have to work with on the most. I think that setting and character are what I dive into immediately with a new project, and then the plot is what comes later for me. And I want it to come naturally from the characters, but also, it's something that I have to really consciously work on at times, because it's not the thing that comes most natural to me. And so I do try to have it come from the characters, and like I think it's great for people who can do this, that they might outline a whole novel and work their way towards the end. I can't do that. The ending looks like a blurry, foggy road up ahead of me, and I have to reach the ending for the first time and then turn around, go back to the beginning, and make my way there again, trying to clarify things along the way. But yes, it's always a negotiation between the characters, and the interplays between the characters that makes new plot elements come forth.
I think the people who can plot like that and outline have done what you're talking about before they ever set pen to paper.
I suppose so. They've gone through the whole thing. Right. Yes. Yeah.
I look at, I'm an outliner for the most part.
Yeah.
I look at my journals, and
Right.
that's where I've done all of that
Right.
pre-thinking,
That
trying to
makes sense.
figure
That
out
makes sense.
what this character wants, what they need,
Yes. Yes.
where they're going, and how they're going to do it, you know. So
I
I think,
like that. That makes sense. I suppose I could get into outlining if it was that way, if I thought of it further down the road, like not beginning with an outline, but because I do try to look on a macro level. I mean, I didn't do this as much with Perpetual West, but I had with Sugar Run. At a certain point, I had a piece of paper for every chapter, and I put them up literally on the wall and was looking at how they interacted with each other. And I guess I was outlining in that way a bit.
sure. Well, so you're not only an author, but you're a college professor. You come to West Virginia to be a writer in residence at the women's prison in Alderson. Tell us a little bit about how that experience started and what it is that you actually do there.
The Carnegie Hall in Lewisburg was looking for someone to teach. They had gotten some National Endowment of the Arts money to send to do a writer in residence, they called it, in the prison, in the medium security prison in Beckley. And I had done a little bit of teaching in prison as a volunteer when I was living in Iowa City, and I really enjoyed it. And so I took them up on that and started there in the medium security men's prison, and then eventually did some classes also in the women's prison in Alderson. And they were amazing classes. They were kind of general creative writing. So we did some poetry, depending on what the students wanted to do, some poetry, some nonfiction, some fiction. And they were some of the best writers that I've ever worked with, and the most curious minds, and just really a wonderfully diverse group. And so the workshops, the comments that people had for each other, I kept telling them, you know, you're actually really lucky to have such a wonderful, diverse group, diverse as far as background, but also age, life experience. I mean, there were some people who, you know, had PhDs and other people who hadn't had a chance to finish high school. And we were all there together talking about their writing. So I felt like it was a great honor for me, and that my biggest role was by being there, I could allow them to spend time with each other. They weren't allowed to get together and have a writing group without me. And so I hope I did teach some, but mostly I think it was just my honor to be there and to help facilitate that space.
Did any of them aspire to publication?
You know, yes, and one, very sadly, one of the students passed away, but his wife did publish his work afterwards. His name is, I'm forgetting his first name because we always used last names only, but Gariano was his name. And she helped to publish his work afterwards. He's the main one that I know, but there is a wonderful publication that comes out of a federal prison somewhere in the Midwest that's called 5 p.m. Count. And it's an anthology of writing. And it's available for purchase. I believe I have several copies I could share with you, but it was really cool. Art and writing from inmates.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So at Duke, do you teach the practice of English only, or is it creative writing?
I teach creative writing. So my official title is the long and I think overly complicated title of Professor of the Practice of English, but I teach creative writing. So I teach Introduction to Creative Writing, where we dabble a little bit in different genres. I do many different fiction classes, but I also, for the first time in the spring, I'm doing an Introduction to Poetry class. The department needs me to do that, so I'm going to step up. And I don't write a lot of poetry myself, but I love talking about poetry, so that's going to be really fun.
That's great.
Yeah.
Before we go, can you give us a little bit of a synopsis of Sugar Run?
Yes, absolutely. So Sugar Run follows my main character, Jody. It begins the day that she's released from prison after 18 years, and it follows her through the summer, basically 3 months after she's released, as she tries to build a new life. She returns to West Virginia, to her grandmother's land, and tries to build a new life, for better or for worse.
And some things don't go as well as she would like.
No, not always. No.
Yeah. Both of your books are available all the usual places, of course, at bookstores, and even if they don't have them on the shelves, they can order them if you
Yes.
want to.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, do you ever see anybody in your classes at Duke that you think may just one day become a novelist themselves?
It is joyful to occasionally read someone's work and go, if they kept at it, I could definitely see something there. Yeah.
That's exciting. So I'm sure you're an inspiration to them.
Thank you. Hopefully.
um, you don't want to give us a little tiny taste of what's coming, do you?
I can talk a little bit more about it, which is it's a love story, high school sweethearts, and it again deals with topics of identity, of gender and sexuality, but also place, what it means to be from a place, and it's set again in a fictionalized version of Alderson. I call it Render in the book, but so it goes back to the same town that I created in Sugar Run, and none of the same characters appear, but the town is a character, and I return there. And as I said, it's in first person, so it follows the perspective of a young woman, Shay, and she is 17, and it's her voice that kind of carries the novel.
And that's what came to you first?
Yes. Yeah, it was. This time it was very much a voice that felt very clearly like it needed to be in first person, which was a little intimidating, honestly, at first. But I felt like, well, okay, if I'm going to do this book, I gotta follow that voice.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you.
Everybody will take an opportunity to read both Perpetual West and Sugar Run. They're fantastic books. That's it for today, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you've enjoyed learning about Mesha and her books. This is your host, Carter Seaton, and I'm telling you to have a great day. Thank you.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.